Close your eyes for a moment, if you like. Imagine standing at the edge of a small village somewhere in the English countryside. The year is somewhere around 1350. The sun has set hours ago. There are no streetlights, no glowing screens, no hum of a furnace turning on in the basement. The only light in the entire world, it seems, comes from a faint orange glow seeping through the cracks of a low stone cottage just ahead of you. It is January. The ground is frozen hard. Your breath fogs in front of your face. And yet, inside that little cottage, a family of 5 is doing exactly what you are about to do. They are settling in for the night. Welcome to history for sleep slow, quiet, unhurried stories from the past, told at the pace of a winter evening in another century. Tonight, we're going to spend time with ordinary people. Not kings, not knights. Not the great lords of Europe who slept in stone castles with servants to stoke their fires. Tonight, we're spending time with peasants, the farmers, the millers, the shepherds, the village women who spun wool by firelight. The people who made up 90% of medieval Europe and whose lives are rarely given the attention they deserve. We're going to talk about something very simple, and yet something that touches every one of us. How do you stay warm through the night when the temperature is below freezing and you have no central heating, no electricity, no modern insulation, and no way to simply turn up the thermostat? The answer is more fascinating and more human than you might imagine. So settle in, pull your blanket a little tighter, take a slow breath, let the story begin. Before we step inside that cottage, it helps to understand just a little bit about the world these people inhabited. Medieval Europe was overwhelmingly rural. The great majority of people historians estimate somewhere between 75 and 90% of the population lived not in cities, but in small villages scattered across the countryside. These villages might have 50 households, or 100, gathered around a church, a mill, and a lord's manor. Life revolved almost entirely around agriculture, planting, growing, harvesting, and then, in the winter months, surviving. Winter in medieval Europe was not merely an inconvenience. It was a genuine threat. The period roughly spanning from November through March, sometimes longer, depending on the region, was a time when food stores had to last, when animals needed care, when disease spread more easily in cold and damp conditions, and when the very young and the very old were most vulnerable. We sometimes forget, when looking back at the past through the comfortable lens of the present, just how different the fundamental conditions of life once were. There was no furnace, no insulated walls filled with modern foam or fiberglass, no double-paned windows, no hot water pipes running beneath the floors, and no option to simply go to the store and buy another wool sweater if the one you had wasn't warm enough. What people did have was ingenuity. Thousands of years of accumulated practical knowledge, passed down from parent to child, from village elder to apprentice, about how to read the weather, how to build a fire that burned efficiently through the night, how to dress a body for warmth, how to sleep in such a way that body heat was preserved rather than lost. They were, in many ways, extraordinarily well adapted to conditions that would leave most modern people helpless. And perhaps more than anything else, what kept them alive through the coldest nights was something we often undervalue in the modern world: each other. But we'll get to that. First, let's talk about fire. The first thing you would notice, stepping into a medieval peasant cottage, is the fire. Not a fireplace in the modern sense with its neat mantelpiece, its decorative surround, its efficient flue directing smoke up and away. In the earliest and most common form of medieval peasant dwelling, the fire burned in the center of a single main room on a low stone or clay hearth, and the smoke rose slowly toward a hole in the thatched roof above. Simple, direct, and surprisingly effective. This central hearth arrangement had been in use in Northern Europe for thousands of years before the medieval period, and it persisted in many rural areas well into the 14th and even 15th centuries. The advantages were significant. A central fire radiates heat in all directions simultaneously. Everyone in the room, family members sleeping on the floor, animals sheltering in the attached byre. Elderly grandparents huddled in a corner could benefit from the warmth regardless of where they were positioned. The fire was never truly extinguished if it could be helped. Allowing a fire to go completely out in the middle of winter was not merely an inconvenience, it was a serious problem. Starting a fire from scratch, using flint and steel or a fire bow, was a time-consuming and often frustrating process, particularly with cold, possibly damp hands in the pre-dawn darkness. Instead, medieval households carefully banked their fires at night, pushing the remaining coals into a tight pile, covering them with ash to slow the combustion, and placing a large piece of hardwood oak or elm, ideally at the center, to burn slowly through the night. In the morning, the coals would still be there, glowing red beneath their blanket of gray ash, ready to be coaxed back to life with a breath and a handful of dry tinder. The fuel for these fires was gathered throughout the year. In England, this was often peat-dried blocks of compressed organic material cut from boggy ground or wood gathered under the rights of houseboat, the legal right of a peasant to collect fallen or dead wood from the Lord's forest for household use. In continental Europe, different regions used different fuel sources depending on what was available. Charcoal, made from controlled burning of wood, was also common, particularly in more urban settings, though its production and distribution made it a commodity traded and sold rather than simply gathered. The management of fuel was a constant, careful calculation. Too little wood brought into the cottage before winter arrived could mean genuine suffering by February. Too much wood, improperly dried, might burn inefficiently and fill the cottage with smoke that irritated lungs already weakened by cold and damp. Speaking of smoke, it is worth pausing here to acknowledge something that modern people often find surprising. Medieval cottages were smoky places. Not overwhelmingly, not unpleasantly so by the standards of the day, but smoke was a constant presence in daily indoor life. The thatched roofs of these cottages, over years of use, became heavily impregnated with tar and soot, which actually had a preserving effect on the thatch itself, extending its lifespan and helping to repel insects and moisture. Soot-blackened rafters were, in a sense, well-seasoned rafters. Over time, as medieval construction evolved, particularly during the 11th and 12th centuries, the wall fireplace with a proper chimney began to replace the central hearth in wealthier households and, gradually, in more ordinary dwellings as well. These chimneyed fireplaces were more efficient at directing smoke out of the living space, though they radiated heat in only one direction and were therefore less effective at warming an entire room. This is why, in larger medieval halls, you often see multiple fireplaces built into opposing walls. For our purposes tonight, settled in a modest peasant's one-room cottage sometime in the 14th century, the hearth is in the center of the room. The fire has been carefully banked. A dull orange glow pulses gently in the darkness. And the family is gathering, at last, to sleep. Before sleep came the ritual of undressing, or rather, of not undressing very much at all. Modern people tend to change into lighter, softer clothing for sleep. In medieval Europe, especially during winter, the opposite approach was often more practical. You slept in your clothes, not the heavy outer garments worn for outdoor. Work the thick wool cloaks, the leather boots, the heavy aprons but the inner layers, the linen undergarments and lighter wool tunics that formed the everyday dress of medieval peasants stayed on through the night. Wool was, without exaggeration, the most important textile in medieval Europe. It was grown on the backs of millions of sheep that grazed across the English countryside, the hills of France, the plains of Castile. It was spun, woven, dyed, and traded on a scale that made it the economic backbone of an entire continent. And for the ordinary peasant family, it was the primary defense against cold. What made wool so extraordinarily well suited to keeping people warm was a set of properties that modern synthetic fabrics have spent decades trying to replicate. Wool fibers are naturally crimped. They curl and loop around each other in ways that trap tiny pockets of air, and air, trapped and still, is one of the most effective insulators in nature. This is why a thick wool blanket keeps you warm, even when it is damp, unlike cotton or linen. Wool retains significant insulating capacity, even when wet, because the trapped air pockets persist even as moisture is absorbed into the fiber. Medieval women, and it was primarily women who performed this work, spent enormous portions of their daily lives engaged in the production of wool textiles. Spinning was a task that could be performed almost anywhere, at almost any time, while watching children play, while tending a fire, while walking from one part of the village to another. The medieval spindle and distaff were essentially portable devices, requiring only one hand, that allowed a woman to produce continuous thread from a bundle of combed wool fleece. That thread would be woven on a loom, a larger, stationary device that required more concentrated effort into fabric of varying weights and textures. Heavier, thicker weaves for outer garments and blankets. Finer weaves for the tunics and undershirts worn directly against the skin. For peasant families, every garment was a significant investment of time and labor, and clothing was cared for, repaired, and passed down accordingly. A good wool cloak might last a generation. A well-made tunic, carefully mended, might serve several children in sequence. The idea of discarding a garment simply because it was worn or unfashionable would have been alien and, frankly, unconscionable to a medieval peasant household. The children of the household often wore smaller versions of adult garments, layered for warmth in the same way their parents dressed. An infant might be swaddled tightly in strips of linen cloth, a practice that served not only to keep a baby warm, but also, it was believed, to help the limbs grow straight and strong. Older children wore loose tunics gathered at the waist, with wool stockings on their legs and simple leather shoes on their feet. At night, the heaviest outer garments were removed and set aside, often draped over a wooden peg or a simple wooden rack near the door. The family would sleep in their inner layers, linen undershirts, lighter wool tunics, wool hose. Over these layers would go the blankets, heavy, thick, and precious. A household that owned 2 or 3 good wool blankets was better off than many. And if that still wasn't enough, you pulled in a little closer to the person sleeping beside you, and you let the warmth of another living body do what blankets alone could not. Medieval bed is one of those subjects that the more you learn about it, the more it reveals about the entire social and practical fabric of daily life in the Middle Ages. Let's begin with the simplest and most common version, the straw mattress. For the great majority of medieval peasants, the sleeping surface was a fabric sack, rough linen or hemp cloth sewn into a large flat bag and stuffed with whatever was soft and available. Dried straw was the most common filling. It was free. It could be replaced every few months when it became flat and musty, and it provided a degree of cushioning and insulation from the cold stone or packed earth floor below. In wealthier households, prosperous farmers, village craftsmen with a bit of surplus, the mattress might be filled with wool scraps, dried heather, or even, at the highest levels of peasant comfort, feathers. The mattress would be laid on a wooden bed frame, if one was available, which kept it off the cold ground and helped airflow from below. Many peasant households, however, simply laid their mattresses directly on the floor, sometimes elevated slightly by wooden boards or bundles of hay. One of the most striking differences between medieval and modern sleeping arrangements is the complete absence of what we now consider the default setting: one person, one bed, in a private room. Medieval peasant families slept together in the same room and often on the same sleeping platform or mattress. This was not a matter of poverty alone, though poverty certainly encouraged it. It was a deliberate and sensible thermal strategy. Human bodies produce a significant amount of heat. A resting adult generates roughly 80 watts of thermal energy, roughly equivalent to an incandescent light bulb. A family of 5 sleeping together in a confined space beneath shared blankets was creating a microenvironment of warmth that no single individual could generate alone. Bed curtains, where they existed, and in wealthier peasant households, they sometimes did serve a specific thermal function beyond mere privacy. A heavy linen or wool curtain drawn around a wooden bed frame created a small enclosed space around the sleeping occupants, trapping body heat and significantly reducing the cooling effect of cold air circulating through the room. Inside those curtains, in a well-layered bed with 2 or 3 sleeping bodies, it could be genuinely, comfortably warm even on the coldest nights. Children typically slept between parents or between older siblings. Elderly family members were positioned in the warmest spot, available closest to the fire if it was still burning at bedtime, or in the center of the sleeping group, where they would benefit most from the body heat of others. This arrangement was not consciously planned as thermal engineering. It was simply the instinctive logic of care. You put the most vulnerable in the safest and warmest place. The headboard, when a bed had one, faced away from the door and windows, shielding sleepers from drafts. Straw was sometimes stuffed into gaps in window shutters. Heavy wool curtains might be hung over doorways to block cold air from seeping in at the threshold. Every detail of the sleeping arrangement was, in some sense, a small act of practical wisdom, accumulated knowledge about how warmth is lost, how it is conserved, and how the human body can be protected through the long darkness of a winter night. Now we come to one of the most fascinating and, to modern eyes, most surprising aspects of medieval winter survival: the animals. In a standard medieval peasant longhouse, a building type common across northern and western Europe from roughly the 11th through the 16th centuries, the family and their livestock lived under the same roof. Literally. The design was simple, a rectangular building, divided internally into two main zones. At one end, the family. At the other, the animals, typically the cattle, the ox used for plowing, perhaps a few sheep, and sometimes goats and pigs. A low partition or simple wooden screen might separate the two zones, but in many dwellings the division was minimal, little more than a change in the level of the floor. This arrangement strikes modern observers as primitive, unhygienic, and unpleasant. And it certainly had its drawbacks: the smell, primarily, and the persistent presence of flies and other insects in warmer months. Medieval people were not unaware of these disadvantages, but the longhouse design persisted for centuries for a very simple reason. It worked. A cow generates an enormous amount of body heat, roughly 2,000 watts of continuous thermal output, more than 20 times that of a resting human. Several cows sharing a space with a family could raise the ambient temperature of a building by several degrees, a difference that could quite literally be the difference between comfortable sleep and dangerous hypothermia on the coldest nights. The animals also benefited from the arrangement. Cattle and sheep huddled in an enclosed space, sheltered from wind, snow, and the worst of the winter temperatures, fared far better than they would have outdoors. A cow that survived the winter in good health could produce milk in the spring, pull a plow in the planting season, and eventually contribute meat and leather to the household economy. The investment of shared warmth was repaid many times over. For the children of the household, the presence of large, warm animals was not merely a practical matter, it was also, in some ways, a comfort. A cow or an ox is a warm, breathing, living presence. The sound of a large animal slowly chewing its cud in the darkness, the warmth radiating from its flank, the occasional low sound of breathing. These were the nighttime sounds and sensations of a medieval peasant childhood, as ordinary and familiar as the sound of rain on a modern child's window. In households without the luxury of a longhouse, smaller cottages with separate outbuildings for animals, the winter arrangement might involve bringing younger or more vulnerable animals directly into the living space. A newborn lamb at risk of freezing might sleep beside the hearth. A sick goat might be kept in the cottage for warmth. Dogs, which in medieval peasant households were working animals rather than pets, would sleep near or among the family members on the coldest nights, their body heat welcomed as a practical gift. There is a reason the old phrase "three-dog night," meaning a night so cold it required 3 dogs sleeping against you to stay warm, has survived in folk memory across cultures. The warmth of animal bodies was a real and valued resource in the pre-modern world, and people used it without hesitation. In the hours before sleep, there was one more layer of warmth to consider: what you had eaten and drunk. Medieval peasant diets in winter were shaped almost entirely by what had been stored, preserved, or was available locally. Fresh vegetables were largely unavailable. Fruit was scarce. The centerpiece of the winter diet was grain, primarily rye, barley, oats, or a mixture of all three transformed into bread, porridge, or pottage, the thick, slow-cooked stew that was arguably the most important single dish in the medieval peasant diet. Pottage was not a refined dish by any standard. It was essentially whatever was available, simmered together in an iron or clay pot over the hearth fire for as long as it took. Dried peas, onions, turnips, leeks, barley, scraps of salted pork or bacon if available, herbs gathered from the kitchen garden and dried in the autumn, all of it went into the pot. The result was a thick, warm, calorie-dense meal that did more than feed the body. It warmed it from the inside out. The thermal logic of pottage was understood intuitively, even if medieval peasants had no vocabulary for metabolic heat production. Eating a warm, starchy, protein-containing meal shortly before bed raised the body's core temperature and set in motion the metabolic processes of digestion, which themselves generate significant amounts of heat. A body well fed on warm pottage was, quite literally, a warmer body. Drink played a role as well. Ale weak, low-alcohol ale brewed from barley was the standard daily beverage of medieval peasants, consumed by children and adults alike. Water from untreated sources was rightly viewed with suspicion, and the mild fermentation process of ale production made it far safer to drink than untreated water. Warm ale, sometimes seasoned with spices if they were available, served as both nourishment and a gentle warming agent before bed. In wealthier peasant households, or in the homes of craftsmen and village tradespeople, hot spiced wine, a precursor to modern mulled wine, might appear at winter celebrations or feast days. Ginger, cinnamon, and cloves, imported at considerable expense from the spice trade routes of the Mediterranean, were believed to have warming properties in medieval medical theory, and their actual thermogenic effects. Ginger, in particular, raises body temperature, slightly gave some basis to this belief. The evening meal was typically eaten while the fire was still at its brightest, before it was banked for the night. Family members gathered close, sharing the warmth of the fire and each other's company. And then, gradually, the activity of the day would slow. The fire would settle into its banked glow, and the family would arrange themselves for sleep. We have been speaking, so far, mostly about what happened inside a single cottage. But surviving a medieval winter was never purely an individual or even a family affair. It was a community project. Medieval village life was, by necessity, deeply interdependent. The strips of land that each family farmed were scattered across the village's common fields, interleaved with the strips of their neighbors. The village plow, an expensive piece of equipment that few families could afford alone, was shared. The village mill ground everyone's grain. The common pasture grazed everyone's animals. In winter, this interdependence deepened. Families who had suffered a poor harvest might receive grain or preserved food from neighbors who had surplus, with the expectation of repayment in some form: labor, goods, or returned food in a future year of plenty. An elderly widow living alone might be looked in on daily, her fire kept burning, her firewood replenished by neighbors. Families with larger homes might shelter relatives or village members whose own dwellings were less well insulated. The shared resources of the village commons, the woods from which firewood was gathered, the peat bogs from which fuel was cut, were managed collectively under rules that balanced individual need against the sustainability of the resource. Overuse was not merely an environmental concern, it was a social one. Potentially depriving neighbors of fuel they needed as much as you did. Communal fires played a role in some medieval communities. Larger fires maintained in halls or community buildings where the most vulnerable members of the village could gather on the very coldest nights. The church, often the largest and most solidly constructed building in any village, served as a gathering place not merely for worship, but for the community's collective shelter during extreme weather events. There was, in all of this, a social logic that we have largely moved away from in the modern world. the understanding that individual survival was inseparable from collective survival, that the warmth of a community was a real and tangible thing, as concrete as the warmth of a fire or a wool blanket. This is not to idealize medieval village life, which was also marked by real hardship, hierarchy, and injustice. Lords demanded labor and taxes from their peasants, regardless of the season. Poor harvests led to genuine famines. Disease moved through closely housed communities with terrifying speed. The lives of medieval peasants were hard in ways that are difficult to fully comprehend from our comfortable vantage point. And yet, there was something in the deep interwovenness of medieval community life, the shared resources, the mutual dependence, the necessity of looking after one another, that produced real warmth. Not merely the physical kind. There was one more institution that played a significant role in medieval winter survival, and it deserves a moment of quiet attention. The monastery. Medieval Europe was studded with monasteries and convents, communities of religious men and women who lived according to prescribed rules of prayer, work, and charity. The largest of these were significant economic and social institutions, owning substantial land, operating mills and breweries, running scriptoria where manuscripts were copied, and maintaining infirmaries that served as the primary medical institutions of their regions. In winter, the monastery's charitable function became particularly important. Most monastic rules included explicit obligations to provide hospitality to travelers and relief to the poor. The monastery's almonry, the office responsible for distributing charity, would regularly give out bread, ale, and sometimes clothing to those who came to the monastery gates in need. During severe winters or famine years, this function could expand significantly. Monasteries with large grain stores might distribute food to entire villages in their vicinity. Their infirmaries treated the sick, regardless of ability to pay. Their guest houses sheltered travelers who would otherwise have faced dangerous cold conditions on the road. For the rural poor, the nearest monastery could be a genuine lifeline in the hardest months. The ringing of the monastery bell, marking the canonical hours matins before dawn, lauds at sunrise, terce mid-morning, and so on through the day, was not merely a religious signal. It was, in a sense, the sound of an institution that was there, that was functioning, that would open its gates to someone in desperate need. It is a small thing, perhaps, in the context of everything we have discussed tonight. But it is worth remembering as we think about how ordinary people survived the coldest nights of the medieval world. They were rarely entirely alone. The night has deepened now. Inside our imagined cottage, the fire has settled into its slow overnight, burn a single oak log smoldering beneath a careful blanket of ash. The children are asleep, pressed close together under wool blankets that their mother spun and their grandmother wove. The ox breathes slowly in the attached byre, its warmth seeping through the thin partition. Outside, snow falls without sound. The family sleeps. What strikes me most, thinking about all of this, is not the difficulty of medieval life, though it was genuinely, often brutally difficult, but the intelligence of it. The accumulated, practical, generational intelligence of people who had worked out, through centuries of trial and survival and failure and adaptation, exactly how to keep a human body alive and reasonably comfortable through conditions that no modern person has had to face in quite the same way. The central hearth that radiated heat in every direction. The carefully banked fire that lasted through the night. The wool crimped, air-trapping, moisture-resistant wool that wrapped human bodies in its fibrous warmth. The straw mattress that lifted a sleeping body off the cold floor. The shared sleeping arrangements that turned individual body heat into a collective resource. The animals, breathing and warm, sheltered on the other side of a partition. The pottage eaten warm before sleep. The neighbor who checked on the elderly widow. The monastery that opened its gates. All of it was engineering of a kind. Not the engineering of drawing boards and spreadsheets, but the engineering of long experience and careful observation. The engineering of people who understood, in their bones, that warmth was not a luxury but a necessity, and who had worked out, over generations, every available strategy for preserving it. There is something deeply human in that. Something worth honoring, I think, as we lie in our warm beds with our thermostats and our electric blankets and our central heating systems that would have seemed like pure magic to a peasant family in 14th century England. They survived. Most of them. Most winters. Through ingenuity, through community, through practical wisdom, and through the simple, ancient warmth of bodies gathered close against the cold. And now, in the warmth of your own bed, with the night settled around you like a blanket of its own, you can let their story carry you gently towards sleep. The fire is banked. The snow falls softly. The family breathes. Sleep well. If this story helped you drift towards sleep, consider subscribing to History for Sleep new episodes every week, covering ancient civilizations, medieval life, forgotten worlds, and the quiet stories of ordinary people across time. Sleep well. History will be here when you wake up.